are the key points, and I'm going to tell you the key points in advance, because sometimes I forget the key points in advance in class. Is that right? Yes, I do. So these are the key points. So even at the end of this lecture, you'll know I did the key points, even if I forgot everything else. Okay, these are the key points. Number one, history is hard, never as simple as it appears. Never. Number two, beware selective amnesia, selective recall, and selective outrage. Why we beware that? Because that's what we humans do. We're really good at those three things. We remember slights, and we forget compliments. Even if someone is, in fact, does a good deed for us and we hate them, we will likely to have selective amnesia when it comes to them. Right, Kaya? Exactly. I had Kaya in class too, and I could never pronounce her name the right way, but I remembered K as Kaya, so Kaya. Number three, history is never static. It is an ongoing dialogue between the past and the present, and I'm going to use Leutze and the purchase of Alaska to illustrate this point. Okay? And actually, I can't see number 4 because of my dumb. Let's see, how can I do this? Well, we don't want Australia anymore.
Just read it to us.
We can see it.
Okay, so what it says is presentory is not history. So this is a word I've invented, just made it up this summer. But presentory, which is present day politics, present day issues, present day concerns, passing off has history. Now the problem is, number 3, because history is never static, because history is always changing, and it has to, because if history doesn't change, it's no use for us. History is largely an evolutionary adaptive measure for us to make sense of our reality. Before the invention of writing, and before literacy and an easy way to contain detailed messages outside our brains, obviously, all human history was oral, and of course it had some strengths and weaknesses. In the oral era of humanity, we had much better memories because we had to. Because Richard has written about Koyukon elders remembering every dang creek down the river. And, like Bruce Chatwin and Songlines in Australia, people just, because they had to, it has to be in here. You couldn't go look it up. The book, however, is a little bit like this complaint that people have, Google making us stupid. Okay, Google makes us stupid, right? But you know what? The book makes us stupid too, in a way, which is very interesting, even though it also greatly extends our length, our reach in some ways. In other ways, we're lazy because we don't have to know things that we used to have to carry around in our brain. For instance, how many of you don't know your kid's cell phone number? You don't even memorize phone numbers anymore. I don't even know my son's cell phone number. I realized this year, Actually, I don't know any cell phone numbers except mine. I don't.
If you know yours, you're doing well.
Right, yeah. I remember mine. You're right, yeah. Anyway, but presentory is not history, because in the oral tradition, history was an ongoing evolutionary thing, and actually oral traditions evolved as present conditions changed to make better use of reality. Because what use was history other than help you find your place in the world? It wasn't an abstract thing. It wasn't something like truth with a capital T, a capital U, R, T, and an H. It wasn't that. It was helping you to live, right? It helped you to live. When writing came in, this somewhat changed, but particularly it changed in the modern world with the idea that somehow you could actually get to a real truth of history. You could know for sure what happened. And this is, in a way, coincides with the rise of science, because we did realize post the age of reason, post the scientific revolution, that in fact we can sometimes distinguish fine bits between what is truth and what is not truth of the scientific method. So even though history is not a formal science in some ways it actually is, because there are definite rules, except it's much more difficult than any science, much more difficult, because the answers are always changing, and so are the questions. Well, anyway, this issue, history is, John Lewis Gaddis, a great historian, I love this quote from him, that he said, cartography, he's talking about maps there, but cognition itself is a simplification that allows us to figure out where we are in the world. That's what history is. It's a necessary simplification. Well, this is the problem. This is always the problem with us humans. Every single thing that's true is also untrue. And every single thing that works also doesn't work. Every time you turn left, you should have turned right, just as equally sometimes. Life is so damned ambiguous, because there's nothing in this world that's bad that doesn't have some good value in it, and there's nothing in this world that's good that doesn't have terrible, bad consequences often. So it's a necessary simplification. Now,
Terrence?
Yeah, well, yes.
John Straley is on the phone.
Oh, hey, Straley.
John Straley, we're at the talk right now. Here's Terrence. He's standing up in front, and here he is.
Put it on speaker.
Hey, John.
Terrence, what did you do? I mean, text messages, just random people I don't know, send me pictures.
I didn't do anything. It wasn't me. It was Nelson.
So you're still at the talk? The talks are still going on?
Well, not only still the talk, you're on the speakerphone in the talk. Would you say hello, John?
You're not saying hello. I just want to know what you did.
Nelson will tell you. Okay, well, anyway, we don't need any more of that. Okay,
I'll
so
get you tomorrow.
so this is.
I don't want any more part of this.
Bye.
Case
Bye,
closed. No, case closed. Just those of you who are not from Sitka, John is a very well-known and a lovely, wonderful woman. And Jan, his wife, is wonderful. She's an expert, a whale biologist, and played a big part in Whale Fest for many years, and at the Science Center. And John was a private investigator for the state of Alaska, but also a mystery writer. Has written several really. And so, if you're out of town, buy a Straley book, like The Woman Who Married a Bear, or
The Bear That Married a Woman.
Cold storage, or some of those things, and then maybe I'll tell him I was really pushing his books. But this is the thing about the way our brains work, and I think the one example in our history that is fantastic reminder that life is not always what we think it is, and it's a simulation. I hope it's going to be here. No, let's see. No, not that one. The next one. The geocentric. Well, I guess I can't show you. What did we do here? Well, we're going to skip it because it's too complicated. But just show you that's a model I got off of YouTube of the Ptolemaic vision of what constituted the geocentric universe, which was believed by a large number of people for at least 1,500 years, if not much longer, and is still believed by a significant number of Americans. According to statistics, up to 20% of Americans believe that the sun revolves around the Earth. But in order to make the geocentric universe work, the planets had to do this. And what's so great is I put this waltz music to this. So the planets make these so-called epicycles, right? And the beautiful thing about his thesis, the beautiful thing is it works. This works. It's a terrific predictive model for where the planets are going to be. There's only one tiny flaw in the plan. It's complete nonsense. Other than that, it works perfectly. So it's a terrific example of something that this was the reality for hundreds and hundreds of years and centuries. That's what the world was. And everybody said, look, it's so plain and so obvious. And in fact, it was completely wrong. at the end of this, if I'll find the music to it, you'll get it out of it, I think. But anyway, so that's one thing, so to remember that history is hard, and so is reality, thinking of what you in fact know. Do you really know what you know? Well, in looking at the Sesquicentennial of Alaska too, there's two kind of key things here. As you'll note, it's commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Alaska Treaty of Cession, and essentially it was a political decision from the state of Alaska. This was decided to be a commemoration, not a celebration, and the cession, not purchase. Now, they didn't ask any historians about this. This was a political decision by our current administration, and one that I have a little problem with for a couple of reasons. One, commemoration and celebration, in fact, are synonyms. And cession and purchase are really also sort of interesting words too. But what do you think, what's the difference between a commemoration? What would people think is the difference between a commemoration and a celebration? What would you think?
Well, commemoration marks the moment. Celebration says it's a great moment, or it says hooray about the moment.
Yeah, but they are, that's what we think it would say, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's commemoration and celebration. Okay, even though commemorate, what it actually comes from is bring to memory, and celebrate, the actual roots of the word mean lots of people. So it actually doesn't mean, if you look at the meaning of the original meanings of the words, it doesn't mean that. Now, cession and purchase are very interesting, though. Cession is from the Latin cedere, to go away, yield, or cessonium, a giving up, surrendering, and purchase, circa 1300. Acquisition, gain, also something acquired or received, a possession, property goods, especially booty, spoil, goods gained by pillage or robbery. So if, in fact, you think that the Alaska Purchase of the Treaty of Cession of 1867, you should have called it the Treaty of Purchase because of the booty. Now the reason is, you can see the thesis here is that essentially the Alaska Purchase in 1867, and I'll use that word because it's a cession from the point of view of the Russians. It's a purchase from the point of view of the Yankees. Now, you don't have to like it, say, except the interesting thing about this is an example of people thinking that purchase actually means a legitimate transaction. Not what purchase used to historically mean, which was like you stole something, which I think is kind of interesting. So it really shows the capitalist religion in this, saying, well, no, we don't want to raise it to the quality of a purchase. So, all right, something's wrong with the Treaty of Cession in 1867, and that's something I hope maybe we'll discuss, of people feeling that something was wrong, something was out of kilter. And the difficulty is, and if you go and look at this lovely art exhibit here, other things around the state, also the Anchorage Museum, the only comment I would make as a historian is that these things are not about 1867. They are about 2017. And remember, that's what people do with their history. They're constantly warping it and changing it to make sense of the present. But we have to be careful, because many people think that as you warp something to make sense of the present, sometimes that you're actually talking about the past. But remember, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. The famous line from that British opening novel. And it is a foreign country. And when you go to a foreign country, you don't demand that they speak your language. You don't demand that they have your same traditions, your same values. The fact is, anyone who was alive in 1867, and they came here right now, would be so at sea. They would be overwhelmed by virtually everything that they encounter, not just electric lights, and not just internal combustion engines, but our beliefs. The beliefs we have today were completely foreign in 1867. Of course, it was seen as okay for people to buy large chunks of land and not consult the people involved, because the United States wasn't a democratic country in 1867. It wasn't. There was really no democratic, liberal, free democracies as we understand them, even in the United States, until the 20th century. Certainly in the United States, still after the 1913 amendment that allowed direct election of senators. Because up to then, remember, the senators were still chosen by the state legislators. So we're going to use this picture here, which has, of course, one tiny flaw in it. He's standing up in the boat, and Leutze was with this photo and this painting, and of course that one. Now, I'm not going to say that the Treaty of the Signing of the Purchase of Alaska ranks with Washington crossing the Delaware, but it does. No. Really. You know, compared to this, of course, it doesn't. It's not even a footnote. Heck, it's not. It won't be less than a footnote. Scribble. Scribble on the page. Okay, so because of this painting. Okay, so we'll go here. Never mind, style. I'm gonna leave that out. But I did say, okay, that people think there was something wrong with the purchase, and the emphasis now is in fact of the neglect of Alaska Native peoples. That's the issue, and it's a real issue, and it's a legitimate issue, but it's also not a real issue and not a legitimate issue. It depends on how you look on it from the time. Now I'm talking about the 19th century. I'm not talking about now, because in the mindset of the people of 1867, this was war, you understand. How was Alaska, what was Manifest Destiny? Manifest Destiny was war. This was not a peaceful conquest of the North American continent by the Americans. The Americans have an enormous capacity for war because it was won, the continent was won by war. Now, some people may flinch at that idea, but it's the truth. That's the reality of it. And the reality is, America was built on some great contradictions to its ideals. Number one is treatment of poor people. They weren't cutting the deal. Number two is treatment of women. They weren't cutting the deal. Number three is treatment of African Americans. They weren't cutting the deal. And number four, Native Americans weren't cutting the deal. Now, that's absolutely Department of the Obvious. But the thing is, you know, there are much better systems like that one. I think it would be a lot better if we were under Stalin, because by God, there was actually a protest from one of my colleagues. He said there shouldn't be a statue of Seward in Juneau, because it was a Manifest Destiny guy. And I said, well, let's put up a statue of Seward. So I bought a little bust of Seward, not Seward, Stalin, to give him. Because in fact, you know, the selective amnesia and selective outrage of focusing on just the ills of U.S. Manifest Destiny in the 19th century without thinking about global history. And what if the United States was not a continental nation? Let's just suppose the United States never fought the war with Mexico in 1840. Let's suppose the United States never acquired California, the West Coast really at all. And it was essentially hemmed in at the Louisiana Purchase along the Rockies. It's, you know, quite likely, actually, that maybe slavery would have continued on in America, right? Or let's say that the North in the Civil would have lost the Civil War. What would have been the continuation of world history in the 20th century? You know, so people who say, well, Manifest Destiny, they say, well, Manifest Destiny is like racism. Well, yes and no. These are political terms. It's just like genocide. They're not, in some ways, real things. They're political terms. It's very different how people define them. Genocide, for instance, is a classic example. During the Rwanda genocide, the Clinton administration refused to use the word genocide. They never uttered it. You can go on YouTube and find it, them trying to waffle about this issue, because they're not really facts, they're interpretations. So anyway, it's not so dang easy to just rule out or to just throw the acquiring of Alaska in 1867 as tarnished expansion. But I'm leading you a little bit. That's not what this book actually is about. This book is still about Alaska, and it's got the painting on there. But this is about the bribery that went along with the case. So the Alaska Purchase was always seen as tarnished, and the thesis of this author, Paul Hopel, was that that's why there was nothing else filed with it. Seward never bought Greenland like he wanted to. That basically, the expansion halted until the Spanish-American War 30 years later, simply because this proved to be too controversial, the expansion. Well, anyway, so Washington crossing the Delaware. Everybody knows this is Leutz's sample. this is a guy I ran into at the Metropolitan Museum of Art sketching it. And here's the two fellows with it. This is a book about Leutz's work, and it has, maybe we could call this signing Seward's Folly. The amazing thing about the painting is, of course, him standing up. This is a review at the time, as people would say, you look at this Washington crossing the Delaware, and you know who the central character is. However, what's fascinating about it is it's completely wrong. This didn't happen. This absolutely didn't happen. It defies all the laws of physics that he's there, because in no way he could stand up like this. It's just impossible. So in some ways, but this historian, David Agatha Fisher, has written a great book about this, because he says, even though the painting is all wrong, it also got something. Because what do you notice about this? Let's go back to the big one. What's the theme in this painting? What do you see? I'll get to this guy in a second who's sketching it.
I see determination.
Bravery.
Bravery. What else? Is it dangerous?
Yes.
Adversity, overcoming adversity. And this is a painting that is influenced by the 1848 revolutions in Europe. And remember, the United States is really the only country on earth at this time that doesn't have a hereditary monarchy, essentially, right? Where people are born from God. God tells you who your ruler is going to be. Now, true, we got this goofy thing, the Electoral College and all that nonsense, but and some of the elections were pretty corrupt. But nevertheless, our system is so radically different from what everybody else has. And in this painting, Leutze, who was a big fan of the revolutions, look at the light there. The light actually is in the wrong place too. So this has been pulled apart by modern scholars, and David Haddock Fisher says, God, they get the whole thing wrong though, because the thing that's right about it is sort of the spirit and the essence of it. This painting is 20 feet long and 12 feet high, and it is a giant sensory experience. And I hope I managed to put the pictures in there, so let me just see if I can do this. What I love about it is, well, okay, this is another thing. Textbook, taking out this watch on his bulge, never mind, you don't have to worry about that. And you also don't have to worry about the fact that it wasn't really the Delaware, it was the Rhine, because he painted it in. This is during World War I, when we hated everything German. Here's the headline. Yeah. It's February 1918, he's crossing the Rhine on the Delaware. Tear it down, it's from the Rhine. And this is what it looks like more accurately. This is a recent piece in the New York Times. What do you think about this? How would this work compared to Washington crossing the Delaware? Now, they're saying, well, this is the right kind of boat. If you go back to it, okay. Is that the same thing? Not as heroic at all, right? Geez, this looks like the Alaska Marine Highway. That's right. Yeah, MS. Is it MS? What do they call them now? Motor V, MV, right? MV Columbia. Running into the dock. But anyway, so, there's the other side. So in fact, this painting is a great example of the presentry and history, and the idea of the past being a history being an ongoing dialogue between the past and the present, because with very few images in American history, this is one, the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima is another, that are constantly reused over and over and over again to tell new stories. And I just have a couple here which I think are still pretty hilarious. This is Washington Crossing the Delaware by Peter Saul, in which now all the folks on the boat are African American, except the one guy who originally was. This is Sports Illustrated using babes to cross the Delaware. This is Lloyd Harris with pies. This is Don't Tread on Me. This is McDonald's. This is, again, another African Americans. These are the swim boys. What would you call those guys? Surfer dudes. Dudes. Surfer dudes. And this is Obama crossing the Delaware. And I'm surprised there must be a Trump one already. I haven't looked for it yet. But let's get to our painting, right? This is a news item, the allegorical picture of Alaska. Well, it's a little bit odd because it's not a great allegory if you think about it. It's not like crossing the Delaware, though it also is an invention because, of course, this didn't happen. It wasn't like this, right? But it's really on the cusp of photography because photography is just about to come in. The first photos of Alaska were actually taken in Bob King was telling me he thinks the first one is a photo of St. Michael taken by the Western Union Telegraph Expedition in 1865. So just think about that we have no photographs pre-1865. And the first ones of Sitka, I think, are 1867 or 68 when, what's his name, came up, the Muybridge, yeah. But anyway, so here is the folks in the painting, and the interesting thing about it from a lot of, I think, is this is the article in the New York Times, sending it to Seward, and look what his, now this is Seward's letter, and he's calling it respectable work of art, and it's going to be solidify long-term relations with America and Russia. It says, it will keep always before me a scene in which two great and friendly powers came together, Department of State, etc., in the Northern Hemisphere, and then he puts that last part on the end. Nor had the artist forgotten to fasten another about the American flag. And it was commissioned by these people in New York City, led by Peter Cooper, the founder of Cooper Union, prominent reformer and, founder of Cooper Union that still exists for art and technology of poor kids, which I always liked because my dad went there in the 1930s. Peter Cooper and others, and they presented the painting to him in 1868. And then, what happens to the painting? Well, one of the interesting things is it falls off the map. And it becomes a legendary painting in Alaska. The A.V. Kasparov, who for now our new museum is named for, they started looking for it in the 1920s. You'll see this note here. This is Dan Sutherland, our delegate in 1929, claiming he was looking 8 years for it. Well, they never wrote the Seward family to ask him, or else the Seward family didn't write back. Why didn't you write back? Didn't you get the letter? But this is the interesting thing about history, because this file I have for you, I started working on this story in 1979. And I forgot that I had done that. So I had this file, including letters from 1979 that I got, that I wrote to actually the widow of the artist who painted some copies in 1932 and to the State Museum. Talk about forgetting stuff. I wrote these letters. These were actually, some of them actually were written by me. And I think, it's amazing. Like, here's a letter I got from the Seward Chamber of Commerce. Dear Terrence, they're trying to give me a contact for the Seward family. They didn't know where it was. They said, William Seward, Surrey's Cottage, Essex, England. I don't know who that, do you know who that is? Yeah, I don't know. So anyway, the funny thing is, they finally get a copy of the painting. It's through Dan Sutherland, Charles Pinnell. They realize that, or they claim here, look at this story, okay? They said it was in the bar of this grill in the Briggs Hotel. Now, there may have been another copy of the painting, but I'm sure this wasn't true. However, the story circulated that it was in the Briggs Hotel, and they might say it there. They say that the painting was 10 feet long, or 16 feet long. No, there it is, yeah. See, 10 feet long and 8 feet high. Now that's a big dang painting. Well, this thing is actually only 6 feet long and about 4 feet high, which is a heck of a lot smaller if you go by the size of the area. So anyway, whether or not, in fact, the one that's actually in Auburn, New York, I think that's the only one really there ever was, and that this story was made up. However, This is Wickersham's diary, James Wickersham, our delegate's diary, 1929, when the first time that he actually saw a photograph of it. So the territory got a photograph which hung for many years here in the governor's mansion, but they didn't even know where the photograph came from. So it's really quite amazing, in fact, that the painting just sort of fell off the surface of the earth as far as Alaska was concerned, even though it's the most important historical painting, because this is we don't really have any images from this at all. Sorry, I keep making so much noise with this. Well, okay, we won't go to that. And so the interesting thing about it, to me anyway, is that the painting shows us the fragility of historical memory and reality. Not just in my own brain, how I could not believe I had got these letters. And from, like I said, from the widow of the artist who did 2 copies for the WPA in 1933. That's what the Alaska State Museum has, as a copy done by that this woman's deceased husband. And then I didn't know it was his ex-wife. They had a big, terrible divorce, and those were the 2 artists who did these copies. Anyway, one is in the State Museum, and we just learned within the last month, thanks to Senator Murkowski's office, there's another copy in the Department of Interior that has been found and that they are refurbishing. And I'm going to try to have that donated to, have Murkowski's office bring it back to Alaska, to give it to the museum in Anchorage or Fairbanks if either of them want it. But no, those are copies. Those are copies. Okay, so I actually wanted to do questions though now, so that I've talked long enough about this. But go ahead, yeah.
Just the original. So where is that?
The original right now is in Anchorage, and I took the stuff out of this talk, but we started negotiating with the Seward House about 3 years ago to bring the painting. Well, I'll just tell you, okay, I'm really impressed by what you've done here in Sitka for the sesquicentennial, but I'm really underwhelmed by the state's commemoration or celebration of the sesquicentennial. I think it's actually been terrible. Now, I'm on the Alaska Historical Commission, well, for 2 more days. Not that I wouldn't get reappointed, but I wouldn't get reappointed, I'm sure, because I was complaining too much. But anyway, so basically there's really not much of a statewide thing. The staff of the Alaska State Parks have done an enormous effort, though, with very little money. They've done a lot, but there has been no interest in the part of the state government to celebrate the sesquicentennial. You just look at what Canada is doing. It's one of their big themes for this year, and this is we should have had this on every cruise ship. And I started this with the Parnell administration, was it before? And the first week Walker and Malott were in office, I contacted them about this, and they had zero interest in this. Well, not zero interest.
What is Canada?
Almost zero.
What is Canada doing?
It's their sesquicentennial, and they're doing all kinds of, it's a national thing that they put a lot of money to. But for us, I thought it would have been a great educational thing. We could talk about race, we could talk about Latin in a real way. Start like this, because this is a really good example. But we also would say, well, look, there is a difference between how you feel now. You can't project yourself back into the past, which is what we do. All humans do this. They all imagine, you look in the mirror and say, who's that old guy? That can't be me. Now, so does this happen to you?
Never.
That's right. We all do that.
Because I can't see the mirror.
That's right. So that's the problem. See, a guy wrote a book called History is an Unnatural Act. Now, don't let your minds go there, ladies and gentlemen. But it is an unnatural act because basically we're constantly fixing the past as our brains go on. That's how we stay alive. You know what? When we screw up, what do a lot of people do? Oh, it wasn't my fault. Yeah. Because then they feel better about themselves and they could go on living instead of just ending it all. So history is a lot harder than people think it is. People think it's a simple issue. All you do is you say what happened. Rush Limbaugh infamously said, history is what happened, quote unquote. What a moronic thing to say. Sorry, if you write Rush Limbaugh, that's fine. I'm glad you do. But that's a dumb thing to say, because if you could only agree on what happened, then that would be terrific, right? But we in fact don't. So, yeah.
Well, I just want to clarify, you said that you got the original to Anchorage. Is it on loan from the Seward House then?
Yeah.
And then there's 2 copies, so there's 3 total. We're talking about an
Yes.
original, 2 copies.
The one is now in the new museum. It previously was in the governor's house, mansion, you know, those people outside thinking the governor's mansion is a real mansion. It's what we call a mansion. Yeah, so there's one in Juneau. And we arranged, and the people at Sewer's House, they worked really hard to help us. It's very difficult for them. They never really have done this before. So shipping a 150-year-old painting is a big, complicated deal. And I didn't know that, and I was in charge of it, sort of. So I mean, I gave it to the smart people, and so we brought it to Juneau. I mean, Fairbanks first, and it's in Anchorage until October, and then it's going to Juneau. I wanted it to come to Sitka, but they refused because of you just don't have the conditions to do it. That's the problem, because he's, like high insurance. It's really complicated because the thing is really fragile. But it's worth going to Juneau to see, or to Anchorage, because it's part of that 150th, or not 150th. Anchorage doesn't have an exhibit on the 150th. Their exhibit is on sort of Russian circumpolar kind of things. But I said, look, you're getting the check that the Americans wrote. Why not get the painting? So it worked out pretty well. But it was a very difficult, complicated thing. It's the main thing that the state did, and I would say in deference to the administration, even though I badmouth them, I would say that they did a good job on that. They helped with that, because it cost around $30,000 to do it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Could you please show the painting again and tell me who those people are? Thank you.
Oh, good. I wrote it down because I can never remember except Seward and so-called Baron Stoichel. He's not really a baron. Anyway, this is Seward is in the center of the painting. Everything points towards him. He's sitting down. He's got the map on his lap. There's
only 6 names.
Yes, you know what? I cut off this guy's name. Anyway, this guy over here works for the State Department. So I'm sorry about that. He's a State Department employee, this guy. Then that's Seward, another State Department guy. Vladimir Dusko is the Russian secretary in D.C. Then Stoichel is the Russian minister for almost 2 decades to the United States. And then Charles Sumner in the back, he wasn't even there, but Sumner made the famous speech. Essentially, it was Sumner in the Senate who carried the day on this. And then Seward's son, Frederick William, who was his assistant Secretary of State. So it is all imaginary, just like Washington Cross and the Delaware. Yeah.
So I was just going to ask, you said that the events that are depicted in the painting never happened, so can you talk about the historical value of a painting of events that never happened?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good
Don't we
point.
call that fiction?
Yeah, that's what my friends call creative nonfiction. So most historical paintings fall into that category. Almost all historical paintings fall into this category. Let's say The Last Supper. Who painted that? Is that Michelangelo or is that Leonardo?
Da Vinci did
Yeah.
famous one.
So this is like that. And it's not exactly like that, okay. I realize. That's why analogies are the poorest form of argument. Okay, but it is a good question, isn't it? What I would say is this is an artifact from 1868. And that's the one advantage that physical artifacts actually have, is that they're contemporaneous. No one would do this right now to commemorate, to honor the purchase or cession of Alaska. Nobody would do this, right? So this tells us a lot about the time in which it's done. And so I made up this stupid poem. Okay. I said, a work of history, like any work of art, often tells you more about the time it was written than the time it was written apart. Apart. Wrong. With Australia's here because he...
Yeah, you should call him back. Recite that for him.
changed his whole life. So this tells us more about the time. It's even though this is about 1867, it tells us about the mindset of the time. And just like those Washington crossing the Delaware paintings, the same thing. What do they tell us about? This tells us about the centrality of William Seward. He really is one of the great human beings of the 19th century. Maybe the purchase of Alaska, one could say, but more importantly for the helping the United States win, the North win the Civil War. Now, if the United States lost the Civil War, not the United States, I shouldn't say it, if the North lost the Civil War, that's a catastrophe for the human race, actually. If the slaveocracy of the South won the Civil War, and it could have won the Civil War, the Brits would have been so glad to throw in with them. The British were almost on the verge of doing it. Seward's job was to keep Britain out. And, it would have been a disaster for the future of freedom in the world. Absolute disaster. I mean, I can't imagine actually how, as difficult as the time we've had of race relations in the United States, how much worse it would have been. Essentially, we would have had the Civil War would have gone on for, it would have been even worse, as bad as it's been, because it really has been bad and a terrible stain on the American dream. Even though, we've got to point out, it wasn't the Gulag, and the Gulag was going on until the 1950s, until the time Alaska became a state, essentially. The Gulag was still in operation, and Solzhenitsyn famously, why did he go to the Gulag? For making a joke. I mean, there was no rhyme or reason for the people, for the maybe 30 million people who they imprisoned, and that, history is hard, and life is actually not fair. That's the basic sort of thing. Anyway, enough about that. What else? Anybody else or anything?
Well, I would love, you were saying that Seward was an amazing person. I have heard something that blows my mind, and I don't know if this is true, so I was hoping you and maybe you could clarify this. I've heard that he was taken off the Senate floor physically taken off because he said, all people are created equal and we need to start treating everybody the same. You've never heard that?
Yeah, I don't know. Could be. I don't know. So I'll tell you, as the position after the thing is, he defended, or he definitely was. Seward made this famous speech about the higher law than the Constitution, and which in some ways is against this ambiguous thing. A lot of people, people who bomb Planned Parenthood or who fly planes into the World Trade Center, they believe in a higher law too. So, all depends on what higher law that you're following. When Lloyd Garrison, who tore up the Constitution, because he said it was a pact with the devil, then there was a higher law, and it's true, the Constitution essentially okays slavery. There's no getting around it. So Samuel Johnson's famous line that all the quacking about freedom comes from these slave owners, these American slave owners. So, but on the other hand, without the Declaration of Independence and without this slave owner Thomas Jefferson, the world would be much different than it is now. So I think to learn history, you have to be a grown-up. You have to understand your parents aren't perfect. You're not perfect. You're going to screw up again and again and again. And nothing is ever as clear-cut as it seems to the person from far away. I would say the less people know about something, usually the more certain they are they have the right answer. There's an inverse relationship. It's all easy. Oh yeah, just do that. Look at all the knuckleheads who profess about juries. Oh, they should find him guilty. Thank God that you don't want to put your life in the hands of dopes on the internet voting yes or no. No, well, how crazy. That's why we need a representative democracy. That's why we have such good leadership in Washington, D.C. right now. That is not an anti-Trump joke. Okay, other questions or arguments? Come on, everybody was supposed to. What's your question? Did you come up with it?
No, not yet.
What the?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wait,
You said you spelled truth,
did I spell it wrong?
Turth.
Did I? Well, Andrew Jackson said, he had no respect for a man, only knew one way to spell a word. So, Trump, that's why Trump likes Andrew Jackson, because of that quote. Anything else? Yeah.
I have a, in your statement about why the rest of the state has not kind of bought onto the sesquicentennial, and it's perplexed me because I served on state, steering committees and things, but a Russian friend of mine who is now an American citizen has really struggled with the idea that most Alaskans have no interest in this. And Sitkans are kind of the exception to that for a lot of reasons. I think there's a culture here that is very powerful in the sense of their past. But what are your thoughts on why do you think even something like this has gained virtually no traction? Is it the economy, or is it new to people, so new to Alaska? What do you think?
Well, if you compare the centennial in 1967 to this, the centennial now, and granted it was post-earthquake, and it was largely seen as a fundraising opportunity by the state government, but they built what's now Alaska land, but they built the state archives, and this wrote a book. I mean, a lot of stuff from the 1967 centennial still is benefiting the state of Alaska, including, I think, isn't your senator, the Civic Center, wasn't that a centennial project? Centennial building. And that's all over, so that's what I think we should have done, I think. Now granted, we've spent a lot of money really stupidly, and we haven't had any taxes since 1978, essentially. Personal individual taxes. So, we have spent a lot of money. This particular issue now is about this commemorate versus celebrate thing, and it's particularly about many in the Alaska Native community who think that this is an insult to their history and heritage. Now that kind of, in some ways, breaks my heart in many ways because Alaskan history is much more complicated than that. It's very difficult because there's been such an amalgamation in some ways of many Alaska Natives that the idea of seeing yourself as if your father is Scottish, say, and your mother is Tlingit, well, okay, you're gonna identify yourself as Tlingit, that's fine. But there is that other half of you. And under the terms of the Native Claims Settlement Act, you have to be 25% Alaska Native to be judged as Native. That's your identity. Now, that's a tradition of the racist heritage of the 19th century, of the one-drop rule. It's goofy. All right, you're 25% this, you're 75% Irish, say, and you're 25% Alaska Native. That means you're Alaska Native. What it really means is that our identities are very multiple and mixed. And I thought a lot about identity. I'm an identical twin. And identical twins are not alike. You think they are, you just don't know them. And so, but there's some great literature on this about people like to have one identity sometimes. And politicians and bureaucrats often play on this, like, say, Slobodan Milosevic did. And I think that's the bad thing for the world going forward, is that people being wedded to one identity that they can't see beyond the fact that history is actually much more complicated. Now, it's very difficult if somebody's shooting at you, that simplifies your life. If somebody's shooting at you, then, your identity is, you're being aimed at, But I don't know what the answer is, other than that one thing that was terribly sad in 2014, it was a stupid incident with this man in Tanana and his kid, and they murdered 2 Alaska State Troopers. And they were crazy and the kid was like 18, like 20, I don't know. And my brother listened to the tape on the thing, because the troopers were just gunned him down. The old man was part of this thing called the Athabascan Nation, which essentially says that all white people should get out of Alaska. And now nobody who's reasonable in Alaska, in the Native community or not, really agrees with this, even though maybe there's a couple of dozen people who subscribe to this. But these 2 cops got murdered in part because of this. So I think this is one thing that really upsets me about not celebrating or commemorating this in the proper way, is that there are a lot of things in Alaska that have actually worked really well. And there's a lot of problems with the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, but it is by far a better situation now than most of the Native American reservations in the lower 48. And I don't know the answer to any of this stuff. I don't know the answer, but I think that unless people can do this without shouting at each other, being angry, then more terrible things would happen like this to a poor kid. This kid's life is ruined. Well, besides the fact that these 2 policemen are dead. And I don't know why. Because if you really looked at the history, you'd think how complicated it is. It's not so simple who the bad guys are. And I always tell my students, man's search for meaning, God, I can't remember his name now. Viktor Frankl. Yeah. He says there's only the two races of people in the world. He said there's the decent people and the indecent people. And he said many of the guards of the Jewish capos in the concentration camps were much worse than Nazis. And to just talk to somebody as a Nazi or a Jew doesn't tell you anything, really. And now maybe I'm just too old-fashioned about this, but I'm really sad that the main thing that appeals to people, like say on the internet about Alaska history, is anger. Is anger, and because we have a lot of problems and a lot of unsolved problems, maybe unsolvable, but it just hurts me because I spent my whole life playing with this stuff. I spent a lot of time on this, and I don't know about it. I really don't know. I mean, I don't so much. I don't know, and these people who don't work on it at all, they think they've got it. But especially bugs me when it's politicians because they don't know a damn thing. Because what they know is they want to influence you. That's what they want. And my sister just came back from Israel last week, and earlier in the year we went to visit one of our cousins in Northern Ireland. Oh God, talk about a place where history is just such a curse. There's no way, I don't see any answer to this. And that's the problem. Not that we're going to have that here, but God, I was in tears when those policemen were murdered in Tanana. My stupid kid and his old man, who's about my age. What an ignorant man. A terrible father. Anyway, they were just gunned down, and my brother listened to the tape recording, and so because as they were dead, and it still kept recording. Anyway, it's an awful thing, and not enough people, I think, have condemned it, even though they were banished from the village of Tanana. These guys, him and another guy. But I thought, geez, what? This is, And then anyway, there's another thing. There's a belief among, I've heard it, and it's actually been taught at the university, but people who don't know, and it was in a publication actually by the National Park Service, written by a lawyer in Anchorage, who said the Alaska Purchase involved 3.2 acres. And this is the story which you'll often hear, that in fact what was purchased were trading rights of the Russian-American company. Now, if in fact William H. Seward spent more than $7 million for 3 acres, that was the worst real estate deal in history, especially up here. Basically, what it says is that Seward's purchase, this is the thesis goes, essentially involved a medium-sized parking lot, or the Diamond Mall in Anchorage. That's about how big it was. This is written by a lawyer. She's a lawyer in Anchorage, and it was in the Alaska Park Science publication. So the government published this. It is completely wrong. It is absolute fantasy, absolute fantasy. But it's this feeling, what does it tell you? It's this feeling, people want this to be illegitimate because it doesn't seem fair. So everybody can understand that because it isn't fair. That's the deal. Slavery wasn't fair either. So, but it's really difficult to do this. In a way, we're left like Job in the Bible. What does God do at the end? Okay, Job, he gives you back his stuff. Does that make it even? God went after you, you know? He made you suffer. There is no answer sometimes to human suffering. I think that's the problem. What if Job was still angry at God? What would have happened? I don't know. Wouldn't have worked out well for Job. Okay, obviously. But where is the justice? I don't. Sometimes in life there is no justice. That's the sad thing, you know. Anyway, I'm over my head, out of water here.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Oh, yeah. Okay.
I have a question.
Sure.
You mentioned bribery
Oh, yeah.
up there. Okay, so I've heard there's a list of all of the
Senators and-
legislators.
yeah.
I would really like to get that list. Where can I find it?
Well, actually, it might be in. Okay, I can't believe I did it. This fine book that the University of Alaska published, Seward's Folly, A New Look at the Alaska Purchase. And the only thing is, why in the world they put a picture of Baranov on the cover of Seward's Folly? It's the Baranov statue downtown. This is the worst cover in the history of books. Brian and I were talking, this is a giant mistake. What? Wouldn't you think that was Seward if it says Seward's Folly? So, actually, so it's probably in there. I can't remember in Hochul's book if he has it, but it was pretty well known, actually.
Yeah.
That's the problem. Now, again, money often changed hands back in those days, too. So things were a lot looser than now, for sure. Okay.
So Terrence,
You have a try?
okay, so you're saying that this painting is a fantasy,
Yeah,
right?
right.
It didn't really happen.
Yeah, right.
Why did the artist put those people in it?
Okay, because those guys were there. Sumner wasn't. I think he's the one that wasn't there. The interesting thing is, it's a thing I used in my class a couple times. It's this guy. It's called the 4 a.m. It's a TED talk in which this guy has this big conspiracy theory. He launches that everything happens at 4 a.m. and it's all goofy. You have to look it up and watch it. You'll see. It's the whole secret to the universe is 4 a.m. This was signed at 4 a.m. Now, he doesn't have that in the talk, but he could. So it was actually at Seward's house, and they did rush this thing through to get it through. It had been on the table a long time. I mean, Russia was in a terrible circumstances after the Crimean War. The Crimean War was a disastrous, humiliating defeat. It proved that they were in no shape to compete with France and Britain. It led also among the reforms of freeing the serfs, simply because they had to. Russia finally had to do something, and this was an easy way of essentially chopping off something that didn't mean that much. They already had Siberia. And in fact, if you look at Texas, if John McPhee said, good place to hide Italy if somebody wanted to steal it, but we could leave it in Alaska. Well, if someone wants to steal Texas, Siberia, it disappears. Siberia is as big as the entire continental United States. Siberia is vast, much bigger than, and Alaskans are always bragging about how big Alaska is, It's nothing compared to Siberia. So, you asked why they're there. Anyway, that's why. Yeah. And Sumner being the key guy in the Senate. He really, it's Sumner, I'll get you in a second, it's Sumner who, from his staff, suggests the name Alaska. Because literally Alaska didn't exist other than the Alaska Peninsula pre-1867. So our name Alaska is an American bastardization of a Russian bastardization of an Aleut term for the Alaska Peninsula. They needed something other than Russian possessions or Russian America, and because this had been mentioned in Cook's journals in the 1770s, which is what they looked at from their reference material, just shows you how they had really no idea what they were buying, actually. They had very little idea. They had some idea, but Seward mainly was looking at the globe. So that's why the globe is actually quite interesting on this. And if you get to see either the copy or the duplicate in Juneau, the names are right here. It says Leutze right there. And then the names of the two, the man and his ex-wife who did the copies are written above there. There's slight differences between the two paintings. Cass Woodward and I wanted to put them together. That's what was originally was our goal. Yeah.
What exactly are they supposed to be doing there? Because they are actually signing the treaty.
They're bragging to each other, I think, how great they are. But they're looking.
Are they negotiating?
Yeah.
They're negotiating,
Yeah.
they're plotting, planning?
Right, yeah. That is imaginative recreation, and Seward's got all the maps on his lap. And if you look in, you can zoom in actually really pretty close on it, and then see it's a North American map that he's got there. But that's the idea. Yeah, they're not.
About the details or something.
Yeah, they're talking about it. But the idea is that this is supposed to be like Washington Cross, and these didn't have any captions. You'd know everything points to Seward, right? Seward was very short. He was a little over 5 feet tall. I forget how tall he was. So, what's that?
So he always
Sat.
Wasn't he severely
Yeah.
handicapped after the
Yeah,
assassination?
on his face. I think it's the other side. Yeah. So, because of the assassination attempt with the time of Lincoln's assassination. Yeah. No, he's a great man. And, people don't believe in the great man theory. Well, we don't have to at school of history. But this was a guy with enormous energy and vision. And even though this wouldn't happen today, it's impossible to imagine. Wouldn't happen. But that's like something from another world. It is like another world. When we're actually looking back, it is like looking at another world. These are all strangers to us. They don't believe in the germ theory. They don't believe in the germ theory. They go to the hospital, they're dead. They're all going to die. The doctors always use that example. They always use the same rag on everybody because it was efficient. And they were really dirty because it proved how good they were, like a butcher. Butchers don't mind getting blood on their things, They like it. Yeah.
So, question about Sumner. So, is he there because of the Senate's role in ratifying the purchase or the treaty, and was there a vote on this?
Yes, he was there first of all because of that. The Senate has to ratify it, then the House has to approve the dough. But he took the lead in the Senate. What really defeated slavery was Western expansion. So you could take away Western expansion, and then slavery still controls the United States of America, because the reason why the South could block every piece of civil rights legislation until the 1960s, was because there was one-party rule. They all agreed on one thing: keep black children out of white schools. That's all they gave a damn about, really. That, and then getting money for federal bases and stuff. And but Western expansion was what they knew would doom slavery, and so in a sense it did. I guess this is contradicting what I'm just saying, but I'm not going to dwell on that too deeply. But it did doom it in the sense that I think slavery would have been ended eventually. I think they would have decided, even with the filibuster rules, to go away with it. But because people forget how powerful the South was. They had all the giants. That's all the presidents, the early presidents from Virginia. So, yeah, but anyway, that's why Sumner was there. Okay, maybe one more and we should quit, right? Anybody else? Okay, well, guys, thank you very much, and thank you for coming up. When I don't have a book to sell or anything.
Thank you so much for coming, everybody. For the next list of talks, you can go to the 150th website. There's a list of all the upcoming sesquicentennial talks that are either here or Centennial Hall. So appreciate your support and have a wonderful evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.